A true story from California. My son said, "You're too old to have opinions." So I stayed silent, then spoke through my will. It was a Thursday evening when I walked up the front steps of the modest two-story house I had moved into 9 years ago, to live with my son, his wife, and their teenage daughter. After 20 years of quietly tending books at the Fresno Public Library part-time, I was heading home, tired but content, until the silence hit me like a brick. I unlocked the front door and stepped inside, expecting the comforting smells of bean soup or baking bread. Instead, there was nothing but stillness and the faint echo of my own footsteps. I called out, "Hello? I'm back from work," but there was no response. I carried my modest canvas bag, library badge, glasses case, knitting project, past the living room into the dim hallway. What I saw stopped me cold. My bedroom, my safe harbor for years, had been dismantled. The bed frame was gone, the mattress missing, and in its place was a stack of plastic bins and cardboard boxes filled with clothes, blankets, and pillows, all haphazardly shoved in front of the door marked storage. My pillow lay on top, crumpled. I pressed my hand to the door and felt the coarse cardboard against my fingers. That's when Laura stepped out. She looked me up and down, her expression flat, as if I were an inconvenience accidentally misplaced. "Oh, Grandma," she said, voice smooth and detached, brushing a strand of chestnut hair behind her ear. "We need extra room for Faith to film her TikTok videos. Those damn backdrops, cameras, lighting, so much gear. We thought it would be more convenient if you slept in the storage room. Temporary, of course." I rested my hands on my hips. My voice shook, but I held it steady. "You did not even ask me. You moved all my things without asking." My eyes flicked over the cardboard tomb of my belongings. Matt appeared behind her, loitering with his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jeans. He glanced at the mess, at me, but refused to meet my gaze. "Mom," he said, clearing his throat so quietly I nearly missed it. "You're too old to have opinions. We thought this arrangement made sense." I took a step forward, heart pounding. "You thought it made sense?" My voice cracked, but I pressed on. "You did not discuss this with me. You just did it like I am not even here." My 13-year-old granddaughter, Faith, stepped into view, her phone hanging from one hand. She was curling a strand of hair around a blow-dryer while talking to a friend. Snorting, she rolled her eyes. "Grandma, stop being so dramatic. It is not like you will be here forever." Her tone landed against me like an unexpected slap, colder even than the silent house. I swallowed, fighting the urge to tremble. "You have no right to speak to me like that." My voice came out more fragile than I felt. I could hardly believe these were the same voices that once called me Mama, Mom, Granny in gentle tones. Laura nodded as though this were a routine transaction. "We just need the space. Faith's account is blowing up. She has opportunities coming. You understand, right?" She smiled at her daughter, oblivious to what that meant. My life erased to accommodate their priorities. In the hallway light, the boxes looked like coffins for my memories. The framed photograph of my late husband at his high school graduation, the collection of stones and shells we brought back from the Yosemite camping trip when Faith was a toddler, the shawl he gifted me on our 50th anniversary, all shoved together in plastic bins as if they were trash. I swallowed hard. It wasn't the cold walls of the storage room I feared, it was what that shove represented. I followed Laura's words back to Matt. "You're too old to have opinions." Not spoken out of care, but disdain. He shrugged, hands still in pockets, looking more like a stranger than a son. "It's not personal, we just thought." He did not finish. No apology, no regret. I pressed my lips together. My chest burned. It always did when I was tired or hurt, but I blinked it back. "You did not ask me first," I said again, hoping some part of him still heard. He looked away and stepped past me, out into the living room. Laura followed, casting one last glance over her shoulder at me, then turned the corner and closed the door behind her, leaving me standing alone in the silence. Faith's voice echoed faintly from a speaker, and then we hit record, and boom, it felt like she had just cursed me with her indifference. I stood in that hallway for a long moment, breathing in the emptiness. The pulse in my ears grew louder than Faith's voice, thudding, insistent. I patted the cabinet by the door where I kept my library badge and knitting. My fingers brushed over the braided wool of the sleeves I had been working on, meant as a gift for Matt before I moved in. That gift now lay forgotten in one of those boxes. The smell of cedar and pipe tobacco clung to my coat. It was my husband's, and I brought it closer, inhaling deep. I closed my eyes and felt my shoulders drop. I was standing alone in a house that was not mine. Voices that I had once known as home had become instruments of exile. I wrapped the coat around me and, deliberate, turned toward the staircase leading to my new home. The boxes shifted as I passed, reminding me of the life that was boxed away. I gripped the banister, but I refused to break. I took with me the memory of my bed, the softness of its comfort, the warmth of its blankets, but I would not take with me the fear of becoming an inconvenience. I would sleep. I would survive. I climbed the stairs and paused at the threshold of the storage room. It was small, dusty, and smelled of old cardboard. But tonight, I told myself, it would serve. It would hold my body if nothing else. I slid the boxes to one side, cleared a space on the plywood floor, and laid down. From somewhere above, I heard Faith's laughter. It echoed through the house. Taking a slow breath, I whispered aloud, "I am still here." And tonight, that was enough. It was years ago when my world shrank suddenly and painfully to a single apartment halfway across the country from where my life had once been full of morning light and easy conversation. After my husband Robert passed from lung cancer at 65, I felt that ache like an eclipse, everything dimming in its place. Suddenly I was alone with Matt, who was in his final year of college, and the quiet that filled our home was thick and unfamiliar. I had spent decades sewing, cooking, working part-time, but loss taught me how to feel the echo of every empty space. Each evening I would fix Matt dinner, perhaps a pot roast or my chicken and rice casserole, and wait behind the kitchen door until he finished. He would smile and say, "Thanks, Mom," and I would nod, knowing tomorrow I would do the same. But the next morning I would wake early and sit at the table with a slice of toast, not to fuel my body, but to hold a moment of calm before everything else began. We sold the mid-century house down the street, the one where I had baked pies, where Robert showed me how to plant geraniums in front of the porch, and with the proceeds, Matt and I bought a smaller home in suburban California. I thought we were starting fresh, closer to his new teaching job, closer to the ocean he had loved visiting as a child. I chose California because I imagined a life where my grandson would build sandcastles while I sat in the ocean breeze, my worn knitting at my feet, and I would feel useful again. I packed each bowl, each pot, each framed photograph of us cooking Thanksgiving together. I packed the chewed-up sweatshirt Matt wore in high school, the one he bluntly told me he did not want because it smelled like old wool, but which I kept anyway. I sold our old family home, my mother's home, because I thought being near family again meant we would be a team, a unit. At first, that is what happened. Matt would call me Mom. The word felt like a warm blanket, a small rescue. Laura, his wife, would greet me with a small smile at our first week, calling me Mom, introducing me to neighbors as my mother. We ate sometimes on Sundays, and I brought dessert, often a lemon cake or chocolate chip cookies, while Laura would fuss around her phone, planning a yoga class or ordering delivery. I sold pies for extra pocket money, and at holidays the table nearly groaned under the dishes, the laughter, the glow of candles. But within months, something shifted. Mom changed. I found myself called Ellen by both of them. It was like they pressed their palms against my voice, muffling who I had been. It happened gradually. They left out the title accidentally or with casual indifference, but once it fell away, the walls of that title stared back at me. I was just Mom, not Mom. My name stripped of soft echoes, ending with an N cold as reading on paper. Mom, can you pass the butter? Became, Ellen, the butter, please. It was subtle, but it left me feeling foreign in a place I had once made home. I remember the first time it really hurt. It was late afternoon. The golden California sun streamed through the bay window. I had woken early and skipped breakfast so I could go shopping. I had learned ballet slippers were dearer than I expected, and I wanted to surprise my granddaughter. She had told me that ballet class made her feel graceful, alive, and so I canceled my toast, forced down a glass of orange juice, and left with my purse, buying the pink satin ballet flats, smallest in the store. I wrapped them in tissue paper with a small ribbon and set them on the kitchen table that evening. When Laura and Faith came home, I watched as Faith caught sight of the box. With a burst of excitement, she tore it open, danced a little pirouette in the kitchen, her face lit up like she was chasing sunlight. "These are perfect," she said, hugging me with arms that once clung to my leg when she learned to walk. I smiled, my heart full, thinking this was why I had come. This was what I had bought my morning fast for. 2 nights later, I was washing dishes when the kettle boiled. In the quiet, Faith walked from the living room, her socks whispering on the floor. She glanced at me, rolled her eyes, and muttered, "Grandma, you spilled again." She pointed to a small ring of water around a saucer on the counter. My hands froze on the sudsy plate. I looked at the ballet slippers lined up tidily by the stove. They looked abandoned, perfect but forgotten. She was right. I spilled again. It was careless. But that moment I felt a cold twist. I had given up my breakfast, wrapped my chest with worry and hope, and now she mocked me for a drop of water. I did not answer. I dried my hands on a towel and walked out of the kitchen, down the hallway to my room, ignoring the lump in my throat. That night, in the hush of my small room, I opened my worn leather diary, the one I began after Robert passed, when each day felt like a question I could not answer out loud. I wrote about that water spot, about the pink slippers, about Faith's eyes that had danced for a moment, then cooled like dew before dawn. I wrote for 3 hours, long after midnight, until my hand ached and the candle burned low. I wrote of the weight of my mornings without toast, the ache of a name changed, a daughter-in-law's glance sharper than I had ever felt before. I wrote, because a woman cannot lose her echo without remembering where her voice fell silent. I traced each letter carefully to keep my mind steady, to know that if the wind snuffed out everything else, my memory would not break. The next morning I did not speak of it at the table. I offered coffee and soft scrambled eggs. I moved the pink slippers to a shelf where Faith would see them every morning before ballet practice. I laid out a small plate with 2 biscuits and honey and set it in the kitchen nook before anyone woke. The smell of orange marmalade filled the room. I watched Faith dance out the door, head held high, her ribboned hair catching the light. I tucked a quilt around me and opened my diary again. On the page was the kind of resolve that only years of soft disappointments can forge. I would no longer be invisible. I would still care, but not at the cost of erasing myself. That day I typed a subject line in my email, "Mom needs a room." I attached a scan of my bank statement. Enough savings to pay my own way. No polite preamble, no explanation, just the subject and the attachment. I included in the email that I would be moving out at the end of the month unless something changed. I hit send and felt my chest tighten, but I nodded at the quiet dignity of doing something rather than remaining crushed by silence. The ping of the sent message sounded like a small bell of dignity. I packed only a few quilts into a bag and returned the key for Mom's room. Laura with a note, "Thank you for your hospitality." I stepped into the hallway, feeling both lighter and ragged, but unbroken. I was giving up bricks of memory, but reclaiming my voice. And as I walked away, I carried with me the morning air that held a promise. I would go someplace I mattered again. It was past 8 o'clock when I came in from the grocery store, the paper bag heavy with vegetables and canned beans I was planning to cook for dinner. I paused at the threshold of the living room, noticing the glow from my son's laptop and the faint laughter of voices. I set the bag down softly and moved closer, as quietly as the creak of old floorboards in this house would allow. Matt was pacing beside the coffee table, phone pressed to his ear. He glanced at me but did not pause his stride. His voice was low, clipped. "Just say she's disoriented," he instructed. "She talks to the kettle sometimes, sleepwalking, whatever. That's enough, right?" I stood frozen behind the sofa, my heart squeezing in that moment between disbelief and something else. Fear, maybe? The kettle? My nightly companion when I brewed tea after reading or knitting? How could he use that as proof against me? I forced myself to breathe, taking a step back, almost knocking into a floor lamp. I bit my tongue and retreated, edging toward the kitchen for 3 quiet minutes of composure. I clutched the bag of groceries close to my chest like a shield. I had never been someone to lose my temper or my voice to something so orchestrated. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Faith, my granddaughter. She held her phone in one hand, the other raised to record. She pointed it at me, smiling indulgently, then glanced at Laura and mouthed something. My heartbeat accelerated, and I thought the world had receded, leaving only the sharp realization that they were plotting. Recording me, editing my words, building a case. A case for being disoriented, crazy, no longer useful. That glassy label meant not needed. Forcing me out. Laura's voice floated down the hall, blissfully unaware she was still loud despite standing near the stairs. Stage 4 Alzheimer at 49? At least they'll take care of her. There was that nervous laughter again. A quick peal, like she wanted to make a joke, cover the cruelty. And then, wouldn't that be a relief? Mom can finally sleep without forgetting where she is? My hands shook. I leaned against the countertop, gripping a jar of tomato sauce for balance. The storm of injustice and sorrow twisted in my chest. I closed my eyes and waited for them to finish so I could walk out and say something firm, motherly. But the calm that fell on me was not silence, it was resolution. I would not give them that moment of spectacle, not tonight. Without knocking, I opened the front door and stepped onto the porch, letting it close behind me softly. I pressed my palm against the glass, steadying my breath in the crisp night air. There on the porch light sat my phone. I slid it from my sweater pocket and dialed a number I had not called in years. "Josh?" I said when he answered. My voice was calm, but to me it felt new, like an anthem that had been buried under disappointment. "It's Ellen." I paused, waited for him to remember. "I need your help. Tonight." The porch light flickered off as I hung up, but my vision was bright, sharper than any clarity I had felt in months. I was no longer alone. I returned to the kitchen, where the world inside felt colder than the night air. I unloaded my groceries slowly, bag by bag, folding my arms over my chest as if guarding a fragile core. The living room was empty, Matt and Laura gone, Faith nowhere in sight, just crumbs of conversations and the echo of those edited words. Tomorrow I would begin something new, but tonight I would brew jasmine tea in silence and let the clean warmth seep into my bones. I would write again in my diary by candlelight, because words mattered, even the ones I did not speak aloud. Tonight, I understood I had the right to speak them on paper, on tape, on my own terms. I sat in my usual spot by the window, watching the porch light dance on the dark pavement. I touched 2 soft squares of knitting in my lap, closed my eyes, and imagined the first time I had taught Matt to hold yarn. Back then everything was simpler. Now the needles clicked steadily, as though marking time, one stitch at a time, weaving a life I intend to reclaim. I stayed there for an hour, until the lights inside went out. Then I headed to the bedroom, pulled on my nightgown, and set my phone down. I repositioned the small recording device Josh had sent me under the nightstand, no bigger than a quarter, no louder than a breath. If they wanted proof that I was no longer who I had once been in their eyes, I would give them the proof they deserved. But first, I would give myself the story I needed to remember who I still was. Before I went to sleep, I opened my diary and wrote just one line: "I am still here." Then, I closed the book, not because I was done writing, but because that sentence felt enough for tonight. In the darkness, I heard the echo of the kettle's hum in my kitchen, the warm steam I shared with my husband long ago, and though it no longer defined me as useful or needed, it reminded me. I was more than their judgment. I was still whole. Tomorrow would be harder. Tonight I would stay silent, but not powerless. It was 2 evenings later when Josh appeared at my door, framed by the soft glow of our porch light. The years had left him a little grayer, his hair still combed back, his suit still tidy, but there was something about the set of his shoulders, a quiet confidence that filled the porch. I stepped aside wordlessly and led him to the kitchen table where a single teapot sat, warming under the lamp. Without a word, he reached into his briefcase and pulled out a small object, no larger than a quarter, with a delicate clip on the side. "This," he said quietly, "will do more than your voice can tonight." He clipped it into a silver hairpin I wore at the back of my head, the pin I bought on our last vacation to Carmel. The device was nearly invisible, and I understood instantly what it could become. Over the next days, I carried on as though nothing had shifted. I made pancakes for Faith after school, folded towels in the linen closet, dusted picture frames that held me on days I had felt less heard, less seen. But while my hands were busy, something else was working too. A record of ugly truths no one would want filmed. Laura's voice, high and breezy, when she walked in unexpectedly one afternoon and sneered, "She's like a discarded balloon, just a useless womb that outlived its purpose." And my breath caught in my throat, though I kept folding towels. Another evening, Matt dropped his voice too. "She's like mold in the house. Stale. Stuck." His hands clenched at his hips, his gaze brittle. But he didn't suspect that every word bounced straight into my purse when I walked away. It was surreal, hearing them speak of me as though I were not there, as though I could vanish without a trace. My granddaughter Faith was the cruelest sometimes. One afternoon she stood in the living room mimicking my voice, just your everyday stop and spooning speech, while pointing her phone as though filming a tutorial. "Grandma's voice is so funny," she said, lips curling into a mock sweet that made my spine stiffen. She took it, her phone close to my face. I stayed calm. In time, after she finished, I gently stripped the pin from my hair and slipped it into my bag, preserving the evidence, not letting her see I knew. Late that night, the memory of that moment prickled my thoughts. The way she lifted my pin without asking. The way her phone screen glowed blue and cold as she held it aloft. That's when I had realized the gravity of what I carried. Then, as I replaced the device, I removed the battery cap, carefully, discreetly, so there would be no noise to give it away. I tucked it flush with the wood of my bedside table drawer. It slipped from sight. I closed the drawer with the ease I had learned over these weeks. No hint, nothing to betray what I was doing. But I felt powerful. Josh called the next morning to check on me. I said I was fine, no need to come. I would manage from here. I felt a strange determination blooming inside, the kind that told me my worth was not measured by the approval of those who reduced me to convenience. Every day, I kept the device hidden, letting their voices spill secrets they thought safe behind closed doors. But I had found my own door, and I was holding the key. The recordings fit neatly together, like dark puzzle pieces of reality. I played a segment once, late at night, alone, pressing play and hearing Laura deliver that poisonous phrase. I held the room with nothing but my own breath, and I recognized a feeling I hadn't felt in years, a warmth that came from owning the truth. A week passed before I was ready to do anything else. In the evenings I wrote, not in my old diary, but in a brand new notebook, labeled simply Evidence. My entries were brief, date, time, speaker, quote. Clean, sharp, irrefutable. My handwriting felt decisive. Josh had said, "Evidence is a language the law understands." So I spoke it in the neatest letters I could. During those days, I also began going through our papers. Statements, deeds, wills, stock certificates, all stored in the spare room under lock. I pushed aside layers of dust and took inventory. I logged every account, every shared asset. I could feel the weight of all I had given them in trust. But now I knew trust alone was not enough. I would turn those pages into proof of what I still controlled. All the while I moved with calm deliberation, no shouting, no hidden cameras, just a simple device in my hair that captured voices and kept my words off their lips. I imagined sending them what I had gathered someday, and the thought brought a relief deeper than any cup of tea. One afternoon, Faith nearly opened the drawer. I watched her hand creep toward it as we stood side by side setting the table. My heart beat fast enough to echo. Her fingers paused. I swallowed and offered to help with the plates. She shifted, nodded, and left, her phone tucked into her pocket. I closed the drawer and wiped my thumb across the grain of wood, as though claiming the space again. Now I felt ready. I was no longer the quiet grandmother fading into wallpaper. I was a witness. And soon I would speak, but only after the evidence spoke forever. That night, as I lay in bed, I held the hairpin in my hand. I traced the device with my fingertip, then placed it beside my journal. There, under the lamp's glow, I wrote a single line. I have a voice that cannot be erased. It was true, and for the first time in a long time, I believed it. It was early morning when I arrived at Josh's office. The sky was still soft gray, each breath of air crisp with the promise of change. Josh greeted me with a nod, placing a familiar mug of black coffee before me. We sat at his desk, old wood flecked with the years of documents processed and quiet assurances given. "I admire your resolve," he said quietly. "This is not easy." I nodded once, swept a stray silver strand behind my ear, and laid out a folder I had carried in my coat. "These are all the accounts I hold jointly with Matt: stocks, savings, miscellaneous bonds." I tapped the top document. "I want them out of his name." He raised his eyebrows but did not hesitate. "You understand what you are doing?" "Yes," I spoke evenly. "I do not owe him anything, not after tonight." The memory of what I had gathered weighed clear and cold in my mind. First, we drafted the new will. I decided on 60% of my estate to go towards Silver Wings Foundation, a non-profit that shelters elderly women who have been abandoned or mistreated. These were women whose dignity had been chipped away until they felt invisible. I wanted to honor that, my gift as a witness. Next, 40% went to Amelia, the registered nurse who had cared for my husband during his final months. She had no obligation to me, but she sat beside me during the nights when grief was too loud to bear alone, helping me tie shoelaces, reminding me to shave, urging me to eat. I had taught her to read when she barely knew her letters, her name, the alphabet she traced with trembling fingers. I wanted Amelia to have something of mine, something she could claim as hers, done by lasting kindness. Josh watched me write out the clauses and sign. Then he slid across a deed transfer for the stocks. I withdrew my signature from the shared account technologies and inserted it into a sole provider clause. Finally, he led me to the bank. It was quiet at this hour, the lobby still echoing faint footsteps of cleaners. We approached the safe deposit area. He entered his code, handed me the key, and I opened the black steel door to reveal a small safe. Inside lay a single envelope addressed to Josh, and beneath it something smaller, my USB. Musty leather journals, the hairpin recorder, a few legal receipts. "Why here?" I asked softly. He smiled a gentle half-smile. "So it is not your home children can search without cause." I placed the USB inside, together with a note in my handwriting. "If I die unexpectedly, medical accident, disappearance, whatever, open this first. Justice exists here." Josh nodded. "Good." We left the bank together. He walked me to my car and finally asked, "Ellen, do you want me to deliver the notice, or would you rather—" I looked up. There was a stillness in his eyes that mirrored my own steadiness. I paused. "I want to do it myself, by mail." He nodded and uncluttered a single envelope from his briefcase. Inside, a typed letter giving 30 days' notice that I would be vacating the house. He sealed it for me. When I drove away, I held the envelope in my lap, breathing in the clean morning air. I did not feel cruel. I felt necessary. I had agreed to disappear from their expectations, not to disappear from life. That evening I baked an apple pie for the final time in that kitchen. The crust was flaky and golden. I sliced one piece, the crunch edged perfect, just as Matt used to like it. I placed it on a paper plate, covered it carefully, and tucked it into the mail notice envelope for delivery later. Later that night, I took everything I would need, a small suitcase, my knitting, a few journals, and that ring I had worn since Robert's death, and I left. The house was quiet, the lights off. I did a final walkthrough, touching the living room table where Laura once mocked me, lingering by the window overlooking the garden I had planted. When I closed the door behind me, I did not turn around. I drove into the dusk and watched the sky swell with violet light. I felt no regret. I had learned the power of my own worth. I had given away everything that tethered me to a life I no longer shared, but I held something they did not: my dignity. At a little guest house near the foothills, I set my suitcase down, tucked the pie into a basket, and settled in. I brewed a cup of tea, pulled out a notebook, and began to write the first letter of the next chapter. I had stayed silent for long enough. Now I signed with intention. I spoke without raising my voice. I signed with clarity. And I finally chose peace. That night I slept with drive and determination humming beneath the quilt, confident that even when I stopped speaking, my actions would echo. It was the morning I baked one last apple pie in that kitchen I'd called home. The house was still and empty of voices. I measured each ingredient with precision, the way I always did. 2 cups of flour, a pinch of salt, 6 crisp Granny Smith apples sliced thin. I rolled the dough with steady hands, humming a lullaby Robert used to sing. As the pie baked, golden steam curled into the air, sweet and heavy with memory. While it cooled, I sat at the table and laid out everything I intended to send. A single dried apple slice, long kept in a glass jar, labeled Matt's favorite crisp edge. The original family photo, unedited and uncropped. Me standing at the table, arms wrapped around my smiling grandson. The small USB drive containing every recording I had gathered, and a folded letter in my handwriting. My voice might not be loud enough to reach your world, but the recorder hears clearly. Once the pie cooled, I sliced a perfect wedge, thin, crunchy edge, soft in the center. I wrapped it carefully in a piece of parchment, then placed it inside a simple brown box I'd purchased at the post office. Beside it went the dried slice, carefully labeled, the photo, the USB, and the note. I closed the lid and tied twine around it. I drove early in the afternoon to the post office near the foothills. The sky was overcast, light drifting like old promises. The postal clerk scanned the box, set the receipt in my hand. I nodded, voice barely a whisper, "Thank you." Then I turned and walked outside, leaving that chapter behind. The next evening, I sat by the fireplace in my little guest room, sipping chamomile tea when my phone lit up. Matt? Then 5 more calls. Then text after text. "Mom, what is this? Why did you send that? Please answer." A final message, almost pleading, "Are you okay?" I turned the screen to silent and placed the phone face down on the nightstand. I let it lie there, unanswered and cold. In the dark, I thought of the first time Laura had called me an object, a useless womb who outlived her purpose. It had hurt in a way I couldn't name. Until tonight. Now, that voice was safely boxed in digital memory, a testament to their cruelty and my clarity. It meant I had no reason to stay silent any longer. Late that night, I opened the letter again and placed it beside the photo and pie crust crumb. It would stay with me always. A reminder of when I chose to leave invisibility behind. I traced my name beneath the words, Mother, Elan. I thought of the house I no longer lived in, how nearly every whisper from within was still mine, until I made them stop. I remembered the boxes of mementos shoved into storage, the rooms that held my memories now empty of me. But in my hands that night, I held something far more powerful, a voice that would outlive them all. I let my eyelids close, and for the first time in months, I felt a quiet freedom settle around me. The house might have been cold and hollow, but here, in the soft hush of a new place, I felt somehow warmer. Tomorrow I would send the notice. Tomorrow I would continue with the next step. But tonight, I could rest, knowing that I had finally spoken, even without saying a word. That slice of pie was gone. But what remained was unmistakable. I had left with dignity, not with anger or brokenness. And as I drifted to sleep, the recorder's voice was quiet, but its message would echo far beyond walls. It was a late autumn afternoon when I arrived at the cemetery. The sky was slate gray, and a soft breeze stirred the golden leaves at my feet. I carried with me a small, dried apple twig, slowly pressed and fragile, a token of memory and closure. I paused at the gate and took a steadying breath before walking down the path toward Robert's grave. Nearly a decade had passed since I laid him to rest, but today felt like returning to a chamber of the heart I had kept open, just to close it properly, once and for all. The grass was damp underfoot, each step imprinting a finality in my mind. Other graves passed in solemn rows, each headstone a story paused. When I reached Robert's marker, set in polished granite with the words beloved husband and father, loved quietly, fought fiercely, I knelt and placed the twig gently against the base. I traced his name with a trembling hand, as though seeking a tether in my own memory. "May kill me with silence," I whispered in that language we shared in moments when English felt too clumsy, "but I live again with the memory you left." I tilted my head upward, closing my eyes. The breeze brushed my cheek like a sigh, as though answering back. I sat down on a nearby bench, folding my hands into my lap. The pinched ache in my chest had softened into acceptance, into a quiet pride in all I had endured and overcome. I studied the stone. I thought of the dinners we cooked together, the way he'd whistle while washing dishes, the sound of rain against the kitchen window when we read by lamplight. As the sun dipped low, I sensed someone approaching. I did not need to look. The weight in the air told me it was Matt. I rose when I heard his voice underneath the wind. "Mother?" He sounded brittle, his voice hushed as though he were inside my chest. I turned slowly, watching him step onto the grass. He wore a coat too light for the season, like a last-minute apology. He stopped a few feet away, eyes red-rimmed. "Mother," he began again, his voice cracking. I'm sorry. I didn't know how much you were hurting." I kept my gaze on the gravestone. I traced the letters with my fingers. Robert's name, our years together. It felt steadier than looking at Matt. He swallowed, stepping closer. "I screwed up. I know that now." I exhaled slowly. "You don't need to understand anymore. No apology could rebuild what had been chipped away. I've played my part. I had walked through every scene they wrote for me, played every role, caregiver, grandmother, silent guest in my own home. Now that act was over." He flinched, but did not press further. The silence hugged us both. He rubbed his coat collar, looking down as though the grass held the answers he could not find. Then he looked up. Can we talk?" I turned back to the gravestone and rested my hand on top of it, a gesture of farewell. "There is nothing to say," I offered gently. "Just truths I have already signed." He nodded, as if he finally understood. He stepped back, took one last look. "Goodbye, Mother." His voice softened to a breath. Then he turned and walked away. I watched his shoulders recede, the space between us growing, safe, final. I stayed another moment, letting the breeze stir the leaves around us. I closed my eyes. I felt a wash of relief, not bitterness, not pain, just the quiet certainty that this was the end of that chapter. I stood and brushed a stray leaf from the footstone. I straightened the apple twig and left it neatly beside Robert's name. I walked away from the bench without looking back. My steps were calm, measured. The path led through fallen leaves toward the iron gate. The town lay beyond it, a world I once sacrificed for, now steadily reclaimed for myself. I reached the parking lot. My shoulders felt lighter, the air fresher. I opened the car door and slid inside, unwrapping a small packet tucked in my coat pocket. It held 2 dried squares of apple, kept safe since parting from that kitchen. I tasted one and closed my eyes. It was tart, crisp, whole. Tonight I would bake a pie. For myself, not for them. And tomorrow I would begin again. I started the car, ready to drive away. The cemetery lay behind me, still and silent. I breathed deep and knew I had chosen myself, and that was more than enough. As the engine grew quiet in the dusk, I whispered to the empty seat beside me, where his jacket still hung. "I am here. I am whole, thank you." And I drove home. It was early spring when I moved permanently into Josh's cottage, nestled against the foothills where lavender and sagebrush grew wild along the garden path. I had carried only 2 suitcases, one with clothing and journals, the other with knitting and a small wooden box full of letters I would never send. Josh met me at the door, his eyes gentle, his presence steady. Without ceremony, he showed me to the guest room, already warmed by sunlight. A kettle stood on the stove, and the scent of chamomile tea drifted through the air. As I settled into the small living room, he poured a cup of tea and placed it beside me. Exactly as he remembered, 2 spoons of honey, the tea steeped for 3 minutes. He did not ask if I wanted milk or sugar. He simply knew. I sipped it slowly, letting the warmth seep into my bones. No words were needed. Each evening, we shared the same sacred routine. After supper, we carried our cups into the sitting room, where 2 leather armchairs faced a low table. Side by side, we settled in, each with a book. Me, one of my old biographies of Eleanor Roosevelt. Him, a dusty volume of wartime poetry. Sometimes I read aloud when Josh paused, a line of verse binding us across generations. When I stopped speaking, he nodded, reflecting in his quiet way that he understood. No declarations, no pity. Just the comfort of presence, and I realized how rare that was. A friendship unburdened by obligation, rooted in memory and mutual respect. When I placed my teacup back on its saucer, I felt no need to explain how I had come to be here. Everything that needed saying was already understood. That I had felt lost, and now I had found a place where I wasn't expected to disappear into silence. One afternoon, I found a letter at the door, postmarked from another town. It was from Amelia. Dear Mrs. Ellen, I hope this finds you well. I am delighted to share that my new clinic, Renewal Health, is finally open. There's a plaque above the door with your name on it. I wanted you to know that your kindness lives on. You helped me learn to read those first words, my foundation. Please know that if you ever need rest or company, the door is always open. I folded the letter slowly with trembling fingers, the paper soft under my hands. A vision formed. That small clinic, the name Ellen Hudson engraved above a door where people might walk in, expecting care and finding kindness. That name carried not price or possessions, but purpose. I felt, for the first time, that I had not traveled so far only to disappear. Josh noticed my silence. He set aside his book and looked at me with gentle curiosity. I held up the letter between us. He read it, eyes brightening. You gave her more than lessons, he said softly. You gave her confidence. I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. I think maybe I helped a life bloom even after mine felt like it was closing. He reached out and rested his hand briefly over mine, a gesture warmer than words. In the days that followed, I found myself writing again, this time not to collect evidence or build wills, but to speak from a place of resolved power. I wrote a letter meant for no one, to be kept in my chest of journals. My children no longer need to hear my voice, but many others will. Through her I live, through acts, not expectations. I did not seek to be remembered, I only sought to remember. I wrote it in the mornings, whenever the sunlight reached my desk, warm and patient. When I paused, I looked out the window toward the mountains, blue and vast, their peaks unmoved by any human story. I felt the distance between what I had lost and what I had built, and it felt enough. One evening, after supper, I placed an envelope on the windowsill. On it, in my shaky handwriting, I do not need anyone to remember me. I just need me not to forget. Josh glanced at it before closing the curtains. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. That night, I brewed chamomile for two and set it on the table. When Josh returned with our tea, I closed my book and let my eyes rest on him, on the soft lamplight, on the veil of quiet contentment that now filled the room. I had left behind a life that squeezed me into invisibility. Here, I had found a life that valued silence as much as speech, stillness as much as sound. I realized then, I no longer measured worth by the volume of voices around me, but by the steady heartbeat of my own purpose. The next morning, sunlight crept through the curtains in long, pale beams. I woke early, feeling the kind of spacious peace I had not felt in years. I sat in the armchair, closed my eyes, and remembered how to dwell inside my own breath, to rest without guilt, to exist without apology. And in that light, I understood that the loudest stories are not always shouted. Sometimes they are written in quiet chapters, woven softly into hospital hallways, library stacks, and friendship that comes without pretense. It was a life I had rethreaded, not for applause, not for recognition, but for the steady, unassuming triumph of a voice that refused to be erased. I leaned back and whispered into the dawn, I am here, I remember. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone quiet who once gave everything and asked for nothing, then I invite you to stay with us. On Grandma True Stories, we tell the truth, the kind that sits deep in the soul and never quite fades. Stories from women who were told they were too old, too quiet, too dramatic, until they remembered who they really were. So if you believe that silence holds power and memory holds justice, then please subscribe. Hit that bell so you never miss a whisper that matters. Because here, when a grandma speaks, the world finally listens.